Hi, this is Dr. Mark Sehl, and it's been a while since I've been on uh, YouTube making a video. So this is a channel therapy for the heart, and I hope you can hang with me for a while. I was thinking a lot about recently about the first 3 years, more or less, of the toddler's life, and man, what an exciting time that is, and those who have children will identify with it, or perhaps um, if you don't have children, you might remember how it was for you. But it was a very important time of a toddler's life, the first early years, you'd say from 1 to 3. And a lot happens in those years. A lot of things that happen that we never knew were happening during that time. And years and years and years ago, we would consider a child very young as not that developed in the beginning, because we just saw them as not as developed as we see them now. For instance, an infant can now recognize the breast pad of a mother by the smell, the breast pad, and that's very advanced. Or the children that were read Cat in the Hat while they were in utero recognized the Cat in the Hat when stories were read to them after they were born. Amazing. And all the things that are happening, interactions with hormones and between the child and the mother before the child is born. So many things. That's why we talk a lot about this idea that not to fight in front of your child, because it can have an enormous impact on them. That does not mean, if anybody's listening, that you fought and you're going to ruin your child forever. They're very resilient. Children are very resilient, but we have to learn how to pace our frustration, frustrating them in terms of what their ability is to be able to tolerate frustration. So the first 3 years, Margaret Mahler wrote about it, Dan Stern wrote about it, Bowlby wrote about it. That's when it developed a secure attachment, and a secure attachment is very important to develop in those years, because if you have an insecure attachment, the child is going to be searching and expending a lot of energy into finding that secure attachment rather than experimenting with the world. And so Mahler wrote about 3 stages of development: of separation, individuation, differentiation stage, the practicing stage, and then the rapprochement. So each stage, the child is beginning to move further towards independence. And so in each stage, you can see different things happening. And it ends up with the rapprochement, where the child is moving away from the mother. And that could cause anxiety on the mother's part, because she or could be the caregiver, could be he, had some separation issues of their own when they were young. So that could intimidate if a caregiver is needy and has some separation anxieties, then they may not want the child to move away, or they might resent it unconsciously. A lot of these things are unconscious, and you're not to blame for them. It's just to try to listen to these videos if you're a prospective parent, and or reflect back on your past and see what's inside you as a result of these different stages. So it's a wonderful, wonderful time. I'm raising a sparrow in the back of my backyard, and not in the back of my backyard, in my backyard, and his name is Charlie, and his mother dropped him off. I don't know how she got across here, but anyway, because he couldn't fly that time. Charlie couldn't fly that. I named her Charlie, and the mother Stella. So anyway, he was all alone, and couldn't fly then. So I've been raising him for the past, I guess, 3 months now. Yeah. So it was thinking about separation and how a child moves away from the parent, and the parent could react anxiously. I remember that first time Charlie flew over the fence. That was quite an anxious moment for me, because I got used to him, and watching him and feeding him, and 3 times a day, which I still do. all of a sudden he just flew across the fence to the other backyard. And I said, oh my God, just, is he going to come back? And so that you live with it, you live with is he going to come back or not. And so he did. Soon thereafter, he flew over across the fence again, and that was the settling moment of my time. So I knew he was going to come back, and he's come back ever since. So children have that tendency to want to run away, and they get some. They walk. They start to walk, climb around, in the first year, and then they start to talk a little bit, and they start to move away. So Daniel Stern wrote, in addition to Margaret Mahler, who wrote about the separation, individuation, those different stages. She was a very famous researcher. Then Dan Stern came along, and he threw a whole wheel in the thinking in terms of some of the psychoanalytic world, because he didn't think that there were definite stages in development, like Margaret Mahler mentioned. He thought that there was a continuous line of development in searching for autonomy on the child's part. So, and that's the way he saw it. He didn't see a reason for instance, like Margaret Mahler, of the symbiotic stage, and the child hatches out from the symbiotic stage. He saw it differently. He saw the child as much more in the beginning, much more developed, and had its own landmarks of going into individuation, like the gaze aversion. That was one way to assert itself. And the gaze aversion, you remember we talked about it with Sehl, that the mother couldn't tolerate the gaze aversion, not understanding that Sehl needed to look away in order to calm himself down. And that's what infants do. When they get stimulated, so the mother was trying to stimulate him more, and it wasn't working, because Sehl needed to have her not go after him so much and not stimulate him, but she was interpreting it as a rejection, so therefore she wasn't able to provide the kind of secure attachment that he needed until he went into therapy with his mother, and then they discovered that the mother had a repetition of her trauma with the mother, where her mother was very passive to her and didn't respond to her. So Charlie then, getting the mix with the birds. So Sehl, once they found out what the problem was, then Sehl did not have to live with the idea that it was his fault at 8 months old, that the difficulty in engaging with the mother was the mother's problem. And courageously enough, she went to therapy and found that out. And Stern has also a story about two twins that were raised, Fred and Mark. And one of the twins, I believe it was Mark, he wasn't forced to look at his mother in the way Fred was. So, but the fact of the matter is, the result of that was that Fred became much more not so developed as Mark. Mark didn't have a problem looking somebody straight in the eye, and he was more free to be. And Fred was very fearful, and that's how he grew up. Not grew up, but that's how they had observed him. And these are all videos, face-to-face interactions with child and parent and the child. So they're amazing what they can see in terms of the impediments in the child's development. And so we can think about this too. If we're parents, if you're thinking about becoming a parent, what's inside you in terms of your history, in terms of your own anxieties about separation. We all have them. We're all human beings. It could be seen as a threat to yourself if the child is growing up and moving away, or if the child wants to say no to you. You might consider that as an insult to you, and it's not really, but you could interpret it that way, because maybe you weren't able to say no to your caregiver when you were growing up, and maybe you were reprimanded, maybe you were scolded, and maybe even more than that, physically or emotionally abused because of how dare you speak up to your parent, because that's what you were taught to do, not to do as a child, not to speak up. Well, speaking up and speaking out is very healthy. So saying no is a major development in a child's toddler's life, to be able to say no. You assert yourself. You state yourself as independent and autonomous from the caregiver, because you're stating, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do that. Strength, that's a strength. So all these things happen. These first 3 years is unbelievable. The formation of the child's individual autonomous self starts during that time. And what happens in rapprochement is that there's a further widening of gulf between the child and the mother. But during that time, the child also wants to come back to the mother, and the mother wants the child to join up with her again. So they both have this period of rapprochement, and they work it out. The problem is, in these first 3 years, if there's too much stress on the life of the toddler due to circumstances out of that toddler's, of course, control, like the death of someone. The worst case scenario would be the loss of the object and the caregiver to something, death or whatever the loss would be, premature loss, separation. Could be a separation between parent and child, and as a consequence of that separation, there could be a lot of conflict in terms of how that child is going to be raised. The child is going to be living in two different homes, for instance. And what about the conflicts that both parents have? Is one parent going to be caregiver going to be talking bad things about the other? And that's the worst you can do, to have a child listen to you, to put down one of the parents, because there's one parent they need to have one parent that's going to be, supposing both are not equally good, at least if you have one, you can have the resource to rely on that. But if both parents are having trouble and not treating the child fairly and humanely and with compassion, there could be very, very disastrous consequences. And the idea of the child seeing the parent, not seeing the parent as a bad parent, as some spouses might make out the spouse to be, and talk about them in a negative way. You never should do that. But sometimes that's happened. And if there's too much of this kind of stress or object loss or death in the first 3 years, and especially in the rapprochement, it can lead to, children need to idealize their parents when they're young. They look at they're everything, they can do everything, they're strong, they're powerful, they're big. They're like just magically created in their mind as can do anything, they don't do anything wrong. But however, you can't maintain that image of your parent all the time, because your parents are not always great. They're not always wonderful, compassionate, loving. So if there's too much of frustration on the child's need for love and attention in one parent, then what they might do is they idealize the devaluation of the parent is necessary, but it has to be over time. It can be abrupt. They have to begin to see that the parent has different faults that they can live with, and they can tolerate those. But if there's too much stress and too much disappointment in those early years, the child needs to develop a self that's idealized itself. That self, an idealization of the self, and then there's a devaluation of the self, or reduction of that idealization, because it has to come to some realistic evaluation of and assessment of one's own abilities, or else you'll be so grandiose that you will think that you can do everything, and nobody can do everything. You have to learn to live with disappointment. So this was when splitting occurs too, because a healthy thing that happens with children, with toddlers, is that they can integrate the good and the bad aspects of their caregiver. They pull them together. It's a very important development. They pull them together, and they see that the parent has faults, and there's good aspects and there's helpful aspects. Sometimes they're compassionate, and sometimes they're not, but they're not always compassionate, but they're not always terrible. So there's an integration of these different aspects of the caregiver, and that makes them a realistically perceived human being. And in this process, they're developing their own perceptions. It's called self and object representations. Representations of the self and representations of the object. So you want those representations to be helpful to the child, like they're not going to end up with a grandiose notion or a devaluated notion of themselves. The same thing with the object. But that splitting, we can even see that splitting happening in the politics now, and it's really unbelievable to me that that this is happening in our country, and where one group of people is seen as the enemy, and the other is all good. It comes down to some kind of interplay between white supremacists on the one hand and other very, very liberal people on the other. But that's not even a realistic perception of who people are either. But what's happening in our country now is that kind of splitting. So the immigrants, they're going to be criminals. You let them into the country and they're going to be taking advantage of people, and they're going to be causing crime and violence. Well, the fact of the matter is that there's a growth of the immigrants, and 113% of growth in the immigrant population, 113% growth. And along with that, there was a 36% reduction in crime. 36% reduction with the enormous 113% increase in the population of immigrants. But we're not told that. We're not. That's not something that some people are saying about immigrants. They're portraying that as people we have to be looked out for. There's paranoia. There's created paranoia, and this kind of splitting is very unhealthy for children growing up. It's very unhealthy for us as a nation. So this is a little political statement, but sometimes when you're in my seat, you have to see that these things are not just all about psychotherapy and individuals. It's always about the health of the nation, the health of us, the health of a community. And in some ways our community is getting pulled apart by such extremes, notions as who we are as groups of people. And Statue of Liberty, the idea behind welcoming people to this country, welcoming them. The tablet on the Statue of Liberty is, give me your tired, your poor, welcoming. The other idea that we have now in the politics is, don't come in here. You're going to be dangerous. You're going to hurt us. You're going to take advantage of us. This is paranoia. It's not true. So anyway, that kind of splitting is happening in our politics, and as we see it. At least that's the way I see it. It's picking an enemy and having that as a scapegoat, so that we don't really have to look at the real important issues that are on our agenda as individuals, as people trying to just participate in life and try without and with being given enough to help us get by. It's like minorities, for instance, don't receive the same kind of health care and that others do. There was one talk I gave about how 80 people in an experiment reached out. One person reached out, and he was black, a male, and he reached out to 80 therapists, and not one of those therapists made an appointment with him. Not one. That's amazing. It's not amazing. It's disgusting. I mean, people are prejudiced, and that we all are, but not one person made an appointment. Although white women were given premium appointments. You know what a premium appointment is? It's like right after you get out of work, 6 o'clock. So you're not, you can make that easy, and you don't have to interfere with anything. So we have all these things inside us, and so in order to help our children, we need to see what's inside us, what's going to make us anxious, what's going to prevent us from providing the secure attachment and surroundings for that child to develop and nurturing experiences and empathetic experiences. And we all want to do that. We all want to be good parents, but something in us doesn't allow us, or some anxieties that we have and experiences that we've had in the past where we were abused or scolded, ridiculed, physically and emotionally abused, sexually abused sometimes. So it's difficult for us to really step up to the table as caregivers because we have all these things. So that's why therapy is so helpful. You can identify these things and help you make yourself a better caregiver and with empathy and concern and devotion to that child who's going to be growing up with you for a long time. So I know you're all going to do it, and if you have any questions, you can always write to me at marksehl@gmail.com and leave a comment if you'd like on this video. So I'm going to sign off right now. I forgot what talk it is, but it's up there in the 50s or 60s, something like that. But I will give the number when I finally publish this talk. So thanks for listening, and hope you have a successful and healthy and welcoming year. We're coming into 2019 now. Time flies. Okay. Good night for now.